So, my fiancée told me I was too boring to marry, left me for a guy who played bass at dive bars. And 6 months later, she was sleeping on couches while I was living in a house I actually owned with someone who appreciated stability. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me rewind to the moment everything started falling apart, because honestly, I didn't see it coming until it was way too late. I'm Maxwell Hendricks, but everyone calls me Max. I'm 35, work as a senior construction project manager in Denver, and my life is exactly what you'd expect from someone with that job description. Stable, predictable, and according to my ex-fiancée, apparently soul-crushingly boring. I've got a 3-bedroom house that I bought when I was 30, a golden retriever named Buster, who's basically my best friend, and I spend most weekends either hiking the Colorado trails or working on home improvement projects because that's what relaxes me after a week of managing construction crews and dealing with city permits. I know, I sound like the most generic guy on the planet, but here's the thing, I genuinely liked my life. I had a clear career path making $88,000 a year with room for advancement. My finances were in order, with $18,000 sitting in my emergency fund, earning a modest but steady return in a high-yield savings account. I wasn't drowning in student debt like half my friends, and I could actually afford vacations without checking my bank account 17 times first or putting everything on credit cards. My buddies used to joke that I was the dad friend of the group, the guy who always had jumper cables in his trunk, knew how to fix a garbage disposal at 2 a.m., and actually read the instruction manual before assembling IKEA furniture. I never thought any of that would be a problem in a relationship. Then I met Brianna Caldwell. Everyone called her Bree. We'd been together for 5 years and engaged for 8 months when everything went sideways. And for most of that time, things were genuinely good. We met at a company barbecue thrown by one of my colleagues back in 2018. Bree was exactly the kind of woman you'd want to bring home to your parents. Easy to talk to, genuinely kind, always laughing at my terrible dad jokes, even when they weren't funny. She worked as a medical office coordinator at a family practice downtown, lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment with her roommate Katie, and spent most nights at my place because, as she put it, my house actually felt like a home. She'd bring Buster treats from the pet store, cook dinner while I worked on whatever renovation project I had going at the time, and we'd plan out our future like a completely normal couple building something real together. We'd already booked our wedding venue for July, a beautiful spot up in the mountains with a view of the Rockies. I'd put down a $6,500 deposit on her engagement ring, a classic solitaire setting with a 1-carat diamond that she'd specifically pointed out months before I proposed. We had a joint savings account we'd been contributing to for 2 years, building up funds for the wedding, and a honeymoon in Italy that we'd been researching and planning for months. For the longest time, I thought we were building towards something permanent and meaningful. Bree would talk about wanting kids in a few years, maybe getting a bigger house with a proper yard for Buster and future children. She'd send me Pinterest boards of kitchen renovations and bathroom designs, always planning, always thinking ahead. I loved that about her, the way she could envision our future together and got excited about the mundane details that would make up our shared life. The first crack in our foundation showed up so gradually that I didn't even notice it was happening at first. It started sometime last fall when Bree reconnected with an old friend from college, a woman named Jessica, who'd moved to Denver after a messy divorce. Jessica ran in completely different circles than either Bree or I were used to. Unemployed musicians, bartenders who worked 3 nights a week and called it freedom, artists who lived in converted vans and talked about following their passion instead of paying their rent. That whole bohemian crowd that looks romantic from a distance but usually falls apart the moment real life demands any kind of responsibility or financial planning. I didn't have a problem with Jessica or her friends, honestly. They just weren't my scene, and I figured Bree was just exploring a different social circle. Everyone needs variety in their friendships, right? But Bree started spending more and more time with this group, going to their gatherings at coffee shops and dive bars, attending their art shows and open mic nights. When she'd come back from these hangouts, she'd have this distant look in her eyes, like she'd just experienced something profound that I could never understand or appreciate. She started making little comments here and there, observations that seemed innocent at first, but carried an undercurrent of dissatisfaction that I was too dense to pick up on initially. She'd mention how one of Jessica's friends had just bought a motorcycle and taken off to California without planning anything beyond gas money and a sleeping bag. "Wasn't that just so brave and romantic?" she'd ask, and I'd nod along while thinking privately that it sounded less like bravery and more like a financial disaster waiting to happen, especially without health insurance or any kind of safety net. Or she'd tell me about another guy in their group who'd quit his stable job at an accounting firm to follow his band on a cross-country tour, sleeping in the van and playing venues that paid barely enough to cover gas to the next city. "He's really living his dreams," she'd say, with this wistful tone that should have been my first real warning sign. Because to me, those stories didn't sound like dreams. They sounded like the kind of impulsive decisions that lead to 35-year-olds moving back in with their parents and starting over from scratch. But I didn't argue. I'd just listen and make supportive noises while internally cataloging all the ways these supposedly inspiring life choices would fall apart the moment someone needed emergency dental work or car repairs or any of the 1,000 other expenses that make up adult life. I thought Bree was just going through a phase, maybe feeling a little restless as we approached our wedding, and the reality of settling down permanently started to feel more concrete and immediate. Then the comments got more pointed and personal. She'd say things like, "Maybe we should be more spontaneous. Maybe we should cancel our venue booking and elope to Vegas instead. Maybe I should stop planning everything down to the minute and just see what happens." I tried to accommodate her newfound desire for unpredictability. I really did. I took her on surprise weekend trips to mountain towns I'd never researched beforehand, deliberately skipped my usual Saturday morning routine of grocery shopping and meal prep to do whatever struck her fancy, and even agreed to attend a few of those dive bar shows where her new friends' bands played to audiences of maybe 15 people who were there more for the cheap beer than the music. But it was never enough because I couldn't fundamentally change who I was at my core. I'm the kind of person who checks the weather forecast before planning a hiking trip, who schedules oil changes 3 weeks in advance and actually shows up on time, who reads instruction manuals cover to cover and keeps all the warranty paperwork organized in labeled folders. That's just how my brain is wired, and 35 years of being this way wasn't going to change because my fiancée suddenly decided predictability was a character flaw. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in January, completely out of nowhere. I'd just gotten home from work around 6:30, was planning to spend the evening installing new kitchen backsplash tiles that I'd been excited about for weeks, and Bree was sitting on the couch with this expression on her face that I'd never seen before. Not angry exactly, but resigned in a way that made my stomach drop before she even opened her mouth. She didn't even let me put down my work bag or give Buster his usual greeting before she said those 4 words that every person in a long-term relationship dreads hearing: "We need to talk." I sat down heavily on the opposite end of the couch, and Buster immediately came over and put his head on my knee like he could sense that something bad was coming. Dogs have that intuition about emotional tension that humans sometimes miss. Bree just stared at me for what felt like 10 minutes but was probably only 10 seconds, gathering her thoughts or maybe working up the courage to say whatever she'd been planning. She told me she couldn't marry me, not in a "let's postpone the wedding and work through some issues" way, but in a definitive "this is never going to work between us" way that hit like a physical blow. She said I was too predictable, too safe, too nice. She actually used the word nice like it was some kind of personality disorder, like being considerate and reliable and thinking ahead was somehow ruining her life and suffocating her dreams. She said she needed someone with more edge, someone who made her feel alive and excited about the future, someone who didn't have a color-coded calendar and a detailed 5-year budget spreadsheet and a retirement plan already mapped out at 35. I asked her if there was someone else because I'm not completely naive, and I've heard this exact speech enough times from friends going through breakups to recognize the pattern. The way her face changed, this quick flash of guilt before she composed herself, told me everything I needed to know before she even opened her mouth to confirm it. His name was Zane Fletcher. He was 32 years old, played bass guitar in a band called Shattered Glass that performed at open mic nights and dive bars around Denver, and apparently represented everything I wasn't and everything she thought she wanted. Bree told me he was exciting and unpredictable, that he lived completely in the moment, that being around him felt like anything could happen at any time. He didn't plan more than a week ahead, didn't believe in traditional career paths, and thought that people who worried about retirement accounts and emergency funds were selling out their dreams for false security. I just sat there processing the fact that my 5-year relationship and 8-month engagement was ending because I had my life together too well, because I'd made responsible choices and built something stable that she now viewed as a prison instead of a foundation. She gave me back the engagement ring that night, sliding it across the coffee table like she was returning a library book, and I didn't try to stop her or argue because honestly, what was I supposed to say? that she should stay with someone she found fundamentally boring, that security and stability were actually good things, that planning for the future didn't mean giving up on dreams, just being realistic about how to achieve them. She wanted chaos and uncertainty, and I offered consistency and security, and you can't compromise on something that fundamental about how you approach life. It would be like trying to negotiate whether gravity should pull things up or down. There's no middle ground that works for both people. The weirdest part was that she seemed almost disappointed that I wasn't freaking out more dramatically, like she'd expected me to beg or yell or make some kind of grand romantic gesture that would prove I was capable of the passion and spontaneity she was looking for. Instead, I helped her pack her things into boxes, methodically and efficiently like I approached everything else. I gave her back her spare key and the garage door opener. I divided up the wedding planning materials we'd accumulated. She could keep the vendor contacts. I'd handle canceling the venue and trying to recoup some of our deposits. I watched her drive away in her Honda Civic loaded with everything she'd accumulated during our 5 years together. And then, I sat on my front porch, with Buster lying across my feet, thinking that at least my dog would never leave me for a bass player who didn't believe in health insurance. That night, after spending 2 hours calling vendors to cancel wedding arrangements and losing most of our deposits in the process, I did something I'd never done before in my life. I posted the whole story on Reddit's relationship advice forum. I just needed to get it out of my head to see if anyone else had ever experienced something this surreal. The response was overwhelming in the best possible way. Within 6 hours, my post had over 2,100 upvotes and hundreds of comments from people telling me I'd dodged a bullet, that she'd be back when reality hit, and that I deserved someone who saw my stability as strength rather than weakness. The top comment, which got over 800 upvotes itself, said something that stuck with me for weeks afterward. "She'll be back when reality hits, but don't take her back. You deserve someone who sees your stability as strength, not weakness. This isn't about you being boring. This is about her not being mature enough to appreciate what she had." Reading those responses from complete strangers who understood exactly what I was going through helped more than I expected it would. It validated that I wasn't crazy for being confused about how basic adult responsibility had somehow become a relationship deal-breaker. The next few weeks were strange in ways I hadn't anticipated. I threw myself into renovating my kitchen because destroying old tile with a sledgehammer turned out to be surprisingly therapeutic, and my friends were absolutely baffled when I explained why Bree had left. My best friend Chad couldn't wrap his head around the concept that being reliable was apparently grounds for ending an engagement. "Let me get this straight," he said over beers one Friday night. "She left you because you have your shit together? Because you plan ahead and pay your bills on time? What's next? Women leaving guys for being too tall or too employed?" I wasn't heartbroken in the dramatic, crying into my pillow sense that you see in movies. I was more confused and frustrated than anything else, like I'd been rejected from a job I was perfectly qualified for based on criteria that made no logical sense. I kept thinking about that phrase, "too nice," and wondering when basic human decency and consideration became something people were supposed to run away from. When did planning for the future become boring instead of responsible? When did financial stability become suffocating instead of liberating? But I didn't chase her. I didn't text her asking for explanations or closure. I didn't drive by the apartment where she was staying with Zane or check up on her through mutual friends. I just kept living my boring, predictable life, completely unaware that Bree's exciting new adventure was about to turn into a complete disaster that would make my so-called boring lifestyle look pretty appealing by comparison. Here's the thing about watching someone's life fall apart from a distance. You get all the information in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle you never asked to solve. About 3 weeks after Bree left, I started hearing things through the Denver social circle grapevine, the kind of details that trickle down through mutual friends and acquaintances whether you want them to or not. Zane Fletcher, the exciting bass player with all that edge and spontaneity Bree was looking for, turned out to be exactly the kind of guy you'd expect from someone whose idea of career planning was, follow your passion and the money will come. He was 32 years old and worked part-time at a guitar shop downtown, and I use the word worked very generously because apparently he called in sick at least twice a week whenever his band had a late gig or he just didn't feel like dealing with customers and inventory. He didn't have his own apartment. For the past year and a half, he'd been rotating between friends' couches and spare bedrooms every few weeks, like some kind of nomadic musician cliché who thought that avoiding lease commitments made him free instead of just unreliable. His band, Shattered Glass, played open mic nights and the occasional dive bar gig, the kind of shows where maybe 15 people show up and half of them are there for the cheap beer and free popcorn, not because they're genuinely interested in hearing original songs about existential angst and corporate oppression. And here's the part that would have been funny if it wasn't so predictable. Bree, the woman who'd left me because I was too financially stable and forward-thinking, was now bankrolling this guy's entire existence. She'd moved in with him at his friend Derek's apartment, except Zane didn't contribute to rent because he was between opportunities and needed to focus on his music without the distraction of worrying about mundane things like housing costs. So Bree was covering his half of the rent, plus buying groceries for both of them, plus paying for gas because Zane's 15-year-old van was constantly breaking down and he didn't believe in maintaining vehicles beyond hoping they'd keep running. The information came to me in waves that I didn't seek out, but couldn't entirely avoid. One of my coworkers grabbed coffee with Katie, Bree's old roommate, and apparently Bree had been asking if Katie knew anyone who was hiring because the medical office where she worked didn't pay enough to support two people, especially when one of them contributed nothing beyond artistic inspiration and emotional availability. Another friend saw them at a bar where Shattered Glass was playing one of their rare paying gigs, and Bree was sitting alone at a corner table looking absolutely miserable while Zane flirted with college-aged girls between sets. The same guy who supposedly made her feel alive and excited about infinite possibilities was treating her like a convenient source of funding while he pursued his dreams of musical stardom that everyone except him could see weren't going to happen. But I didn't reach out. I didn't offer advice or express concern or try to warn her about what seemed like an obviously unsustainable situation. I just kept demolishing my old kitchen backsplash and planning out the new tile work like a normal, boring person who actually finishes projects instead of abandoning them when they stop being fun or require sustained effort. Then, in early March, something happened that I didn't expect and hadn't been looking for. I met someone who would completely change how I thought about relationships and what it meant to find the right person. Her name was Olivia Porter, and she entered my life in the most mundane, practical way possible, which should have been my first clue that she was exactly what I'd been looking for without knowing it. I was at Home Depot on a Saturday morning, which was basically my natural habitat during renovation projects. I was standing in the tile section trying to decide between two different grout colors when this woman approached me and asked if I had any experience with outdoor kitchen installations. She was probably in her early 30s, professionally dressed even for a weekend hardware store run, and clearly knew what she was talking about when she started asking specific questions about weather resistance and maintenance requirements. Turns out Olivia was a landscape architect working on a client's backyard renovation that included an outdoor kitchen, and she needed advice about materials that could handle Colorado weather extremes. We ended up talking for over an hour about construction techniques, project timelines, weatherproofing strategies, and the satisfaction that comes from actually finishing what you start instead of abandoning projects when they stop being exciting. She mentioned that she owned her own landscape architecture firm, had bought a duplex as an investment property 2 years earlier, and was living in one half while renting out the other half for passive income. When I told her about my kitchen renovation project, she didn't just nod politely like most people do when you mention home improvement. She asked specific questions about cabinet hardware and wanted to see progress photos on my phone. She understood why I got excited about finding the perfect subway tile at a good price, and why proper planning made projects more enjoyable, not less spontaneous. Olivia was 32, had been divorced for 2 years after what she described as an amicable split with no hard feelings, and had her life together in a way that made perfect sense to me. She had a business plan, a retirement account that she actually contributed to regularly, and a 5-year strategy for expanding her firm. We exchanged numbers, and our first official date was coffee the next Saturday that somehow turned into a 3-hour conversation covering everything from hiking trails and investment portfolios to our shared belief that people who don't plan ahead usually end up disappointed. The difference between being with Olivia and being with Bree was like comparing a house built to code with proper permits to one held together with duct tape and wishful thinking. Olivia didn't need me to be spontaneous or edgy or mysterious. She just needed me to show up consistently and be reliable, which was literally the only thing I'd ever been genuinely good at in relationships. We planned weekend trips months in advance, texted each other about contractor recommendations and changes to building regulations, and somehow that felt more romantic than any midnight adventure or impulsive road trip ever could have. Her friends were architects and project managers and small business owners, people who understood that having detailed plans wasn't boring. It was smart. They got excited about tax strategies and market trends and the satisfaction of building something that would last longer than the initial enthusiasm that created it. Meanwhile, Bree's situation continued its predictable downward spiral. In late March, I heard through the grapevine that Zane had spent their rent money on vintage guitar equipment he'd found on Craigslist, some rare bass from the 1970s that he claimed would transform his sound and attract the attention of record labels. They'd gotten into a massive fight about priorities and financial responsibility. He'd called her controlling and materialistic, and then he'd stormed out and essentially disappeared for 3 days without answering his phone. When he finally came back, it was only long enough to pack his equipment and announce that he'd been invited to join another band that was heading to Portland to make it big in the indie music scene. He left Bree with a lease she couldn't afford on her own, no forwarding address, and about $40 in their shared checking account that was supposed to cover utilities and groceries for the rest of the month. Then came the phone call I'd been half expecting since February. It was almost midnight on a Thursday when my phone rang with Bree's number, and my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. But something made me answer, maybe curiosity or maybe some leftover sense of obligation from 5 years together, even though she'd made it clear those years meant less to her than 2 months of excitement with a bass player. The second I said hello, I heard crying on the other end. Not quiet tears, but full-on sobbing where someone can barely catch their breath long enough to form coherent words. She tried to explain what had happened, but it came out in fragments between gasps and sniffles. Zane had disappeared completely, blocked her on social media, and changed his phone number. She'd been evicted because she couldn't cover the full rent on her medical office coordinator's salary. She was currently sleeping on Katie's couch, the same friend she'd lived with before she moved in with me all those years ago. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Bree had traded a 3-bedroom house with a fenced yard and a golden retriever for a corner of someone else's living room, all because she wanted someone with edge instead of stability. Then she said something that actually made me angry, not sad or sympathetic, just genuinely frustrated with how predictable this entire situation had been. She said, "You always knew what to do in situations like this. I miss having someone reliable to talk to. Like I was some kind of emergency contact she could call when her exciting choices stopped working out. A safety net she could fall back on after spending months telling me that everything I represented was suffocating her dreams." I took a deep breath, stayed calm, and told her exactly what she needed to hear, but probably didn't want to accept. I said she needed to figure out her living situation without depending on other people's charity. Maybe consider moving back with her parents temporarily, until she could save up for a security deposit somewhere affordable. I suggested she stop expecting 32-year-old men who sleep on couches to suddenly develop financial responsibility and long-term thinking. I did not offer to help. I did not offer money or a place to crash or advice about lease negotiations. I gave her the same practical guidance I'd give to any acquaintance facing a housing crisis. And then I told her I had to go because I had an early meeting the next morning. She asked if we could meet in person to talk through her options, and I said no. Simple as that. No lengthy explanation, no attempt to soften the rejection, just a clear boundary that I wasn't going to be her backup plan when excitement turned into chaos. The calls and texts continued sporadically over the next few weeks. Voicemails asking me to review lease agreements because she didn't understand the legal language, requests for recommendations about affordable neighborhoods, hints that she was reconsidering some of her recent life choices. Every message carried this tone of desperation wrapped in false casualness, like she was trying to rebuild a bridge she'd burned down while pretending she was just making friendly conversation. I didn't respond to any of them. 6 months later, Olivia and I were talking about moving in together, planning our future with the same methodical approach that Bree had once found so stifling. We bought a duplex together, started a joint savings account for long-term goals, and built something real out of shared values and compatible life philosophies. Good men give you a future. Bad boys just give you stories.